Welcome, everyone. My name is Federica Cherubini. I work at Condé Nast International in London. Sorry for my voice. I've lost my voice in 3 days of Perugia. But it's good because it's not me talking today. It's David Cohn, who's Senior Director at Advanced Digital. If anyone in the room is really good at corporate structure, our companies are share an ownership somewhere. But we've never met. We've met a few days ago, and we've never worked together. But we want to say it. So David today is gonna be talking about millennial media went wrong, but there is so much in this talk. I think is gonna have a very good conversation afterwards. We want to leave some time for questions. He's going to talk about new media, old media, the platforms, and generally about the journalist's values in relation to changing technology. Over to you.
Hello. Oh, hey. I'll start by saying again, I hope to get through a little bit of if I'm honest, a speech here, but I'd really love to get to a dialogue as well. So please think of questions, including challenging questions, pressing questions. I totally welcome that. And I'm going to apologize in advance to the translators. I sometimes get excited and talk fast. I'll try not to. But I do want to thank you for this sort of opportunity. And I'll start by saying, like 10 months ago is when I pitched this talk. And at the time, I thought maybe we as an industry weren't spending enough time thinking about Facebook and the media's relationship to it. But today, I think we increasingly understand the problem, right? So I'm still going to restate it because I think it's important to be cogent, concise, and precise here. But I recognize that I won't be the first person to tell you that we've landed in a bad spot, right? And I don't just mean a bad spot in terms of how we make money, right? I mean we've landed in a bad spot in relationship to what our mission and values ought to be, right? What we should strive for. Now, I want to put a few caveats here, right? To be clear, I don't worship new media for the sake of its newness, nor am I a dogmatic traditionalist. This isn't about teams or sides. I think we should be past that. I have my biases, and I come from a certain school of thought about new media. I've actually been part of projects that I considered at the time pretty radical, right? And we can argue about whether we should be experimental or not, but this talk actually isn't about that. And at the end of it, if you want to call me a curmudgeon, I would say that I am a curmudgeon 2.0. The original curmudgeons were sort of considered anti-change and anti-technology, and that's not me. And again, I think my career speaks for itself. I don't want to do like a resume, but if you look me up, I've done startups and projects that at the time, again, were considered radical. But I am concerned about where we put our values in relationship to changing technology, right? And in some respects, what I'll be talking about, there's actually a growing movement outside of media that is focused on this. There's a man named Tristan Harris, for example, who has brought a lot of attention to the design of technology and how it manipulates user psychology, and perhaps not for the betterment of mental health. And the last caveat that I'll put out there is that I'll talk about potential solutions. This talk will be divided into three sections: diagnosis, symptoms, and solutions. But of course, nobody really knows what's going to work, right? So while I don't want to be the guy who flips over the table and doesn't offer to help pick anything up, I also don't want anyone to think that I'm standing up here on a pedestal thinking that I know what the solutions are, or not acknowledging that these are incredibly difficult questions and we might find ourselves in an intractable position. So there might not be a clear path forward, but because I have a microphone, you have to listen to me, and I'll tell you what I think might work. But let's begin, like I said, sort of three parts. The first part is diagnosis. So let's start with the diagnosis. I often say all code is political. Om Malik, who was a great tech reporter back in the day, he put it this way. He says, companies have a core genetic profile, and that it's tough for them to deviate from it, right? I'll be using Facebook here as the giant elephant in the room, but really they are a stand-in for all technology platforms and our relationships to those platforms. So every technology platform makes decisions, right? Like you must use your real name, You can only use 140 characters. This is where you upload your resume. Resumes don't belong on our site. Images will disappear in 24 hours, so on and so forth. Right? These decisions, this code, becomes law. Right? It is political. It determines use. So an analogy, think about your CMS, your content management system that you use to create stories in your organization. Right? That is code, and it dictates the manner in which you can or can't produce stories. Right? You've probably had an experience where you had an idea for a story that you couldn't accomplish because the CMS wouldn't let you. Right? And that's because code, again, is political. It has consequences. In that instance, I would say the CMS is your first editor. Right? We often don't think about it that way, but that's what it's essentially doing. It's creating an editorial dictate about what you can or can't accomplish. It is your first editor. But let's go back to Facebook. Right? So what is the code of Facebook? Right? What is its true purpose? What is its dharma, I would say? Facebook's true purpose is never really been hidden. Right? It's a place where you create your online persona and connect with friends and family to understand their online persona. Right? It's a social tool. Mark Zuckerberg originally referred to it as a quote-unquote social utility. Right? It's right there in the name, Facebook, a book of faces, right? A book of personalities. Right? This is where you create your online identity. Right? Now compare that to Twitter. Right? Twitter is a place to share what's happening now. Right? Every platform has a different structure to serve different purposes. Every CMS has its limitations and features that enables it, right? And I would say all tech platforms, or the ones that we talk about, are really just content management systems for the public, right? We work on content management systems that are closed, only open to us, but these are content management systems that are open to the public, right? And again, the CMS is your first editor. So when you get frustrated that you've run out of characters on Twitter, that's not a bug, it's a feature. So if you agree Facebook is designed to build identity, and that has consequences for the news industry, right? The news that we produce becomes clay or fodder to help somebody do this on Facebook, right? And I would say a large segment of the news industry, we can call it millennial media, we can name names, I'll sort of skip that. That's not what's interesting to me, because the caveat I'll say is there are some leaders in this space, but I think the entire industry kind of followed a little bit. But the industry changed its editorial approach to better serve this need on Facebook, right? How should I express myself, right? News, as we might envision it, if we were talking to each other in a closed space, it would say it's meant to inform somebody about the world, right? But on Facebook, news is used to help somebody inform their friends about how they feel about the world, right? What values they identify with, what they disavow or claim as their own. News provides the moment and ability to create your identity, to virtue signal, essentially, right? And again, let's compare this to another platform like Twitter or Reddit, where personal identity isn't as central to the news service. In fact, news and information becomes more of a good in and of itself, right? On Twitter, you don't retweet a piece of breaking news to signal to people how you feel about it, but rather because something just happened and they should know about it, and this is a platform to, say what's happening right now. And to be clear, this is not to say Facebook bad, Twitter good, right? Twitter has made platform decisions that are horrible, right? Like you have the problem of egg trolling, for example. That doesn't happen on Facebook. Why? Because Facebook, you have to use your real name, and on Twitter, you don't. So you have another massive problem, right? But again, because Facebook is the elephant in the room, I'll continue to focus on them, but my point is that this is a method of critique that can be applied to any platform, right? Think about what is their goal, their purpose, how the code has been refined to accomplish that, and what are the consequences, especially for editorial. And again, because of its outsized influence in terms of traffic, Facebook and this idea of creating identity has been at the heart of social distribution strategy that has sort of raged through the journalism industry over the last few years, right? The secret to BuzzFeed and other viral content is that the stories aren't written for an initial audience. They're written for that audience's friends, right? And I'm going to say that again because I think that's actually the real twist, right? You're not creating content for your audience. You're creating content for your audience's friends, right? So this headline isn't meant to inform somebody about the world. right? The headline is a tool to be used by somebody to inform others about who they are, right? This is me when they share the headline. This is what I believe. This shows what tribe I belong to. When I see content shared by a friend, I'm not first learning about the world. I'm primarily learning about my friend, right? And as a result, facts don't matter, right? Truth does. In the case of this slide, it's Tim's truth, right? Tim's view of the world. He's the one that's sharing it. His truth may be based on facts, and it might not be, but that doesn't matter, right? Because Facebook is not designed to be a source of facts or news. It's designed to be a social setting where personal identity, values, personal truths are shared. So if Tim can accomplish his goal without facts, that's not a bug. That's a feature, right? We construct our digital identity on Facebook because that's what the platform is designed to do, and all acts center around the creation and networking of that. So again, a large segment of the news industry changed its editorial strategy to accommodate this natural user behavior. In some ways, I would say it's the media equivalent of identity politics, right? It represents a move away from producing content that is valuable for the information it contains, and instead values content because of how it gives a reader the ability to affirm or declare some sense of identity on Facebook. It's part of the reason why post-truth was word of the year in 2016. And we'll talk a little bit more in a bit about how I see the difference between truth and fact. All of this is to say that we entered a Faustian bargain, right? Which is an agreement in which a person abandons their spiritual or moral principles in order to obtain wealth or benefits. It's essentially a deal with the devil, right? And to be clear, I totally understand why this Faustian bargain was made, right? Facebook represents the largest audience ever assembled in human history. And that's not an overstatement, right? I did not just exaggerate. Facebook represents the largest audience ever gathered in human history. So, of course, there's a ton of market pressure to enter into this bargain. The only thing I would say here is that we in the industry understand that market pressure, but our audiences don't, right? They only understand their own behavior on Facebook, which is to create identity. And the fact that they don't understand the same market forces that seem so obvious to us is also a problem. So I'll plant a flag there because I'll mention that again, this idea that we kind of understand the market pressure and others might not. So we're going to move on now into the symptoms part, but I'll start by one thing that how we sort of would talk about this internally, right? Internally in our industry, there's been a positive spin to everything I just said. And here's how that was kind of pitched. I've called it platform intelligence. Others have called it social journalism or visual journalism, etc. In fact, just a few years ago, it was one of the cornerstone lessons that I think a lot of us in the industry were talking about to each other when we would go to different news organizations. And it's the idea that we should understand how each platform is different and attracts different audiences, and we should tailor our content accordingly. Right? Again, it's basically saying all code is political, and editorial content should adjust according to the local laws. So when Facebook, for example, decides that all video on their platform should autoplay on silent, two big code decisions, a big shift happened, right? All of a sudden, every video on Facebook had very grabbing images in the first 3 seconds. 3 seconds because they determined that 3 seconds is what counted as a view, so that was the most important part. Because it was on silent, we put text on screen, right? That was not the case more than a few years ago, right? But the platform changed, and the numbers followed. And this is a stylized change that we all recognize now, right? It's an editorial change in response to the platform. And at the heart of this is a little bit of an admission, I would say, right? That we can't do it on content alone. We have to use a kind of manipulation, right? We have to adapt to the space that we don't control. And there are consequences of this. And again, these are what I would call symptoms of that diagnosis part earlier. While I am not at all suggesting that today's political polarization is, that media is the source of it, I do not think we have effectively combated it, right? And I would argue that part of the press's job is to allow a community to speak to itself constructively, right? Lots of digital ink has been spilled on the idea of filter bubbles, if they exist or not. Maybe they aren't bubbles, but there are certainly echo chambers, and we should recognize that serious players in the media shaped themselves to take advantage of this, right? You sort of never let a good crisis go to waste, right? maybe you lost something in universal trust, but you would gain something in a kind of bubble trust. And actually, we see this happening in all kinds of corners of our culture, right, online. So 3 USC professors did a study on food image sharing. And some of what I'm about to say is actually quoting them directly. But in their study, they wondered why the most popular food porn images depicted like massive burgers that it's obviously impossible to eat. It's like dripping with bacon and cheese, or like pizzas stuffed with tacos and sparklers on it, or whatever, right? And the answer is that the algorithms that drive participation and attention getting in social media, the addictive gamification aspects such as likes and shares, invariably favored the odd and unusual. So when someone wanted to broaden out beyond their immediate social network or immediate audience, let's say I have an audience of people that like burgers, one of the most effective ways to get beyond my initial audience to achieve mass appeal turned out to be going extreme, right? Taking an existing norm in the community, big burgers, and expanding on it. It almost guarantees a poster some, 100 likes, some comments, 15 minutes of social glory. But as each user tried to top the outrageous image of the user coming before, the extremes, right, of this food porn ratcheted up towards even more sensational tower burgers and cakes until we have what you see, right? What was once the extreme began to seem normal, and the ends separated further from those who remained in the middle, right? So now imagine you're a vegetarian, right? How do they feel looking at this? And before we start judging the meat eaters, vegetarian food images can be just as extreme of a different nature, right? Very clean plates, very small portions. Each quinoa grain is named. And I'm sure that offended some of the paleo diet practitioners, right, who have their own extreme images. The point is just that extremes beget extremes. And this food example, it can be applied to politics as well, right? You figure out who your base audience is, and from there, the extremes begin to separate out. Another symptom is what I might call troll media. A writer, Umar Haq, describes it this way. He says, first came Slate's contrarianism, and then BuzzFeed's listicles, Upworthy's you'll never guess clickbait headlines. And these were early, unrefined versions. But today, trolling itself has been refined and distilled into an industrial product, rolling off the assembly lines in a like routinized, formulaic, predictable affair, right? A job. Trolling as a business model is making trollery the dominant form of American discussion. Cable news, which in this one I use cable news, has been guilty of this for years, really. They'll have people on who are specifically saying things to enrage or troll an opponent, right? It's the enrage to engage model. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not saying that media can't have a point of view or even be confrontational. In fact, I think it should, right? But in the example from this slide, and I cover the image because I know the presenter and I know the organization, and overall I think they do good work, and again, I don't want to be like seen as totally pointing fingers here. The accusation of being Hitler, to me, is an extreme and trolling statement, right? Although it's actually often used, right? And as an aside, for starters, I actually worry language like this will actually help Trump get reelected. In fact, the fact that at least I'm sure if I were talking to Americans, but even here, I didn't even have to say who this was supposed to be about. It was probably assumed is itself interestingly enough, right? But each time something extreme doesn't live up to reality, the trust of the organization or the person that delivered the exaggeration dips a little bit, right? And in the case of this, as long as Trump doesn't commit a genocide, anyone who compared him to Hitler will be harder to trust in the next election, right? So when it comes time to vote, someone might look at this presenter, and the presenter might say, vote the other way, and they'll say, wait, didn't you say he was going to be Hitler? And there hasn't been a genocide. So you were wrong about that. What else are you wrong about now? In fact, that gets even more personal when it's the line is, everyone who supports him is deplorable, right? Well, I know my identity because I have Facebook to create my identity, and I know I'm not deplorable. So if you're wrong about me, what else are you wrong about, right? That train of thought is not hard to follow. And I think it's the natural train of thought for anyone who feels that their personal character is under attack. So, and again, to some extent, that's an aside. This is why I'm concerned about this kind of trollery. And again, I'm not saying that news can't have a point of view, right? But we should also keep in mind Poe's law, right? And question if we are making an important statement or just trying to troll. So Poe's law for the internet goes like this. Without a clear indicator of the author's intent, it is impossible to create a parody of extreme views that cannot be mistaken by some readers or viewers as a sincere expression of the parody's views, right? Basically, sarcasm is really hard to pull off online, is what that means. And I'm not exactly sure how we might formulate this for news consumption, but I think it's something we should consider in how we frame what we say when it's opinionated. And again, I think news can be opinionated. I'm not arguing for some kind of voice from nowhere, but I do think that certain signals should be given, and we should think about if we are putting in extreme views because we believe them or because it's part of our Facebook strategy, right? And that's actually the real point, right? The burger analogy, right? That burger was not actually appetizing, right? The chef didn't make it because he wanted somebody to eat it, right? He was doing it to show off, right? And so when we make statements, are we doing it because we believe it, or is it part of our Facebook strategy because we want to show it off? We want to give it to somebody who can then show it off more, right? That's the real hook. Only two more symptoms, I promise. Another symptom is what I might call meme media, right? And so here's a CNN article, and you can see the headline, right? 19 of the 30 deadliest mass shootings have taken place in the last decade. What has changed in the federal level? And if you clicked into that article, it was actually a one-word article, and it just said nothing at the bottom. This was what actually happened if you clicked into the article, right? To me, that was a meme disguised as news, right? It was meant purely to allow a user to virtue signal an idea or a general truth, but not to inform them about the world. For starters, it's actually not wholly accurate, right? At the federal level, Obama made some executive orders that changed some gun laws. He proposed others that were defeated, and actually I think one of them was taken down. And there have been 210 state-level gun changes. But, and again, I'm getting nitpicky here, but again, the point of this was actually not to be factually accurate. It was meant to convey a truth, right? This is where truth and facts collide, right? Something can ring true, especially if it's about how you construct your identity, like somebody who wants gun control, even if it's not factual. A great example of this was a Mike Daisey story at NPR, right? So Mike Daisey was actually a playwright who went to China to report on Foxconn and the appalling working conditions of the factories that produced Apple products, right? It's a story that we all know is true, right? And his piece was a hit when it first ran on NPR. Unfortunately, it turned out that Daisey made up quotes, fabricated scenes, and more, right? The story was true, but it wasn't factual, right? So here's the thing. This American Life, the NPR program that ran it, could probably vouch for the truth of the Foxconn story, right? I don't think there's anybody who could earnestly deny the truth of worker exploitation in China, right? And to dedicate a show about factory workers in China who suffer these working conditions is a good thing. But the specifics of the Daisey story were all a mess, right? The facts, the accuracy, the details, they weren't just wrong, they were lies. He made it up, right? He spun a tall tale, right? And he did this not to be evil, but to get a truth across, right? For him, the purpose of the story was to share truth and not the facts. And there's a tension in journalism, and it's not new, right? But it is expressing itself in different ways today, right? And I kind of think, like fish in water, we don't really see this tension. It's just sort of ever present. But it's the tension between truth and facts, right? The two don't always align. The speed and quantity of stories with this inherent tension is increased. Marketers, meme makers have used this, I would argue, to their advantage, right? The internet as a medium of exchange is neutral on this tension. Journalists, I would argue, should have a strong bias, if not an ultimatum, to fall on the accuracy or fact side of this tension. And I think other actors will have a bias, if not an ultimatum, to fall on the truth side of this tension. What we really need to figure out is how, what we think about players that want it a little bit of both ways, right? So BuzzFeed, for example, does some serious and great reporting. they also share platitudes like this, right? This teacher taught his class a powerful lesson about privilege. The post draws out a lesson plan where students have to crumple up a piece of paper and try and shoot it into a trash can. And the students at the front of the room have an advantage over the students in the back of the room. And then that's how this teacher explains privilege to the students. And it's actually an excellent platitude, and it certainly has truth to it, right? But does the teacher really exist? Did the lesson really happen? Are the quotes real? Or is it a general accounting of an incident? And most importantly for a post like this, does it really matter? We don't fact-check stories from Chicken Soup for the Soul, right? And I don't know if there's a European equivalent, but like we don't fact-check fairy tales, right? We know that they're fairy tales because the purpose is to convey truth, not fact. And that's fine, right? I think this story falls into that space, and that's a good thing. These stories feed the soul, right? And I've told my fair share of campy, moral-filled fables, right? But I would never pass them off as journalism. And if I were being published by an organization I ran that does journalism, I'd want to be clear when I'm switching from truth to fact, right? Otherwise, I could run the headline, extra, extra, you're perfect in every single way, and I'd get tons of clicks. And I think when we create content that is designed to help somebody create their personal identity on Facebook, that's actually what we're doing, right? You are perfect in every way, right? Share that. All this leads to what I would call the inarticulate echo of a real problem, right? Fake news, right? Which is a phrase that I actually don't really like, and I know a lot of people don't, but I think the reason why it's been successfully weaponized is because it's the echo of a real complaint, right? I recognize that it's maybe controversial to say that fake news has some validity, even if it's ultimately a sloppy word, but ask yourselves this, right? In the diagnosis part of this talk, did it make sense, right? Do you agree that Facebook is a place where people make their own identity? Have news organizations changed our editorial approach to better cater to this user behavior? If you answer yes in your mind, even just a little, what makes you think that readers don't intuitively understand this as well, right? Readers aren't dumb, right? They recognize the manipulation of the content we've made to suit these Facebook needs. They recognize the content as somehow a little artificial, as manipulated, as artifice, as fake, right? This isn't where fake news comes from at all, but it's part of why the label sticks a little bit, I think. I'm glad you like these. And again, most readers don't understand the market pressure that we're under, right? They only see the values that we profess, and that it doesn't always match up with the service we provide. And that opens up enough cognitive dissonance for doubt to creep in, right? I do think that there are nefarious and malicious actors that have taken advantage of that doubt to better help their own objectives, and that's super unfortunate. And it gets really tangled because there are actors, again, purposely putting out misinformation, and so I understand why we bristle being compared to them or being put under the same umbrella. Totally get that. And to be clear, I'm not saying all actors in this space are the same or equally culpable, but I think we need to reflect on this phrase, fake news, and why it was successfully weaponized. How much cover for it did we provide through this strategy? The last symptom is just really quick. It's just the idea that all of our content began to look the same, right? Everything is being tailored for platforms that we don't control. All content is dictated by the same laws that we follow, and so things become the same, right? The concept of creating viral content tailored for a specific platform is very indefensible from a branding point of view, right? So, for example, this is a Facebook video. I might cut it off before the end, and if I do, you won't be able to identify which organization made this video, right? I almost dare you to start thinking about it now. Who do you think made this video, right? What? Al Jazeera Plus? Good guess, because you thought that I worked there, but it's not. It's not Al Jazeera Plus. If we get to the end of it, you'll see. But that actually makes my point, right? Who knows, right? Who made this, right? Most people can't guess either. So when you come across a good video on Facebook, do you think, thanks, LA Times? This was an LA Times video. For making this video. No, instead you think, thanks, Facebook. You did it again. You gave me what I wanted, right? So who really wins in this exchange from a branding perspective? right? The LA Times, no. In fact, Al Jazeera, AJ Plus just got credit for it. Instead, Facebook really gets the credit for it, right? But again, I've railed enough, I think, about the problems and some of the symptoms. So the next question is how we can turn around. And again, I'm about to offer ideas, but I don't want to sell them as silver bullets or even try to claim that these are wholly original. Some of them are not. The first thing I'd point out, again, is this idea that all platforms are different. And some put news and information more at the center of their service than identity, right? So maybe news can't do social, but it's possible that social can do news. So what do I mean by that, right? Think about the difference between Facebook and maybe early Web 2.0 news sites like Dig or Reddit or Delicious or others. And many of those haven't made it, right? They're failed. Reddit is still around. News is at the center of these communities, right? Identity comes second in relation to news, right? The front page of the old Dig or any subreddit has a communal value. It's social, right? But that communal value is related entirely to the news and information. Communities like these have a self-correcting mechanism for facts and a respect for nuanced debate. Even if agreement can't be reached, there's still an aspiration for learning through comments and argumentation, right? There is a way to make social spaces for news. Most examples of it that we've seen require, again, this idea of socially constructed shared space, right? Think Wikipedia. Super boring, I agree. It's not like a lively news site, but Wikipedia, right, is a socially constructed shared space of news and information, right? The editors, we don't care who the actual people are who make the edits. We care about the end result. That's the central value. So part of the solution, I would say, is for you to think as an individual, where do you spend your internet time, right? Think globally, act locally. Where do you contribute your time and energy as a user? And also ask, where does your organization commit its resources, right? The Washington Post has a team that is dedicated to Reddit. Does yours? Why not, right? If we as an industry decided to put resources into the platforms that we thought provided better incentives that enabled us to act according to our values, why wouldn't we all praise it as such, right? Use it more as a resource, create a positive feedback loop of traffic with that community, right? Think of this as the digital equivalent of divesting from oil and investing in green technology, right? What is our green version of social space, right? The flip side of this, if we can't divest from oil companies, maybe we can convince the oil companies to become more environmentally friendly, right? I think BP kind of did this. Can we get them to stop dumping their toxins, right? I actually thought, for example, Facebook's decision in January to de-emphasize publishers' links in the newsfeed was positive in a way, right? They did this experiment where they created in the Explore section a separate newsfeed in certain countries, and that was a place where you could go to get all the news, right? And in that feature, that product, right, code was a little fiefdom, where news and information was centrally valued just for what it is, news and information. Right? Imagine taking that to extreme, a big split in the news feed, right? You have one that is, you know, the majority of the content is the main feed. It's related to personal relationships, and a separate feed that includes news articles, right? How might people treat these feeds differently? How might design changes and thus user behavior change? Of course, this is a double-edged sword when it comes to traffic. It would create a giant reset between Facebook and publishers, and it could be a little bit of the devil you don't know, right? Again, we're in this Faustian bargain. We're here. We have a relationship to that traffic. So I also want to, again, recognize the intractable position we might find ourselves in. Facebook does a lot for us, right? But it's worth asking, right? What changes to Facebook? And again, pick your platform. This is a critique that can be applied to any platform. But what changes can we imagine that might help center the values we want to see? Right now, Facebook in theory is listening, and they've made some changes. In fact, that slide of the headlines, they've changed that design a little bit to make the source of the news organization a little bit bigger. The font is a little bit bigger. So it's an outdated slider. And that is actually a really recent change. Again, I think in recognition of the fact that they were downplaying the sources and upplaying the personal identity of the person who shared. Right now, it feels like some of the changes they're doing, Facebook is doing, is somewhat placation rather than really tackling the underlying problem. But again, this is an avenue to explore, right? The only other caveat that I'd mention is it's totally under Facebook's control, right? We actually don't have a say in that solution. All we can do is put some pressure, right? And ask nicely. The amount of pressure we put is under our control. And you might imagine some world where news organizations work together and go on strike and stop putting content to Facebook, especially if we found like a social news space as a refuge. But I actually think that's totally far-fetched, right? Sure, we're kind of on the same side, but news organizations are also in competition with each other. And the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so if a bunch of news organizations were to divest, there would be others who would invest to take advantage of that thing. But I still think it's a thoughtful, a useful thought experiment, because it would help us think through what our demands might be in the event of a successful media strike, right? What would we do if we were able to pull that off? And that tells us what we want. I don't think the demands would just be monetary, right? I think they'd be about values, right? I think about like the early labor reforms of the 20th century. It's not that we wanted children to be paid more. We actually wanted to eliminate child labor, right? Because it's immoral, right? That's a big difference. Another idea is decentralization through blockchain. And I think it's totally early days for something like blockchain. And this is not the talk to explain it or why I think it has potential, other than to say that there are blockchain-powered startups like Steemit, Poet, and Civil that are exploring this territory. And I think it's potentially very fertile ground, right? It's the decentralization of it that holds interesting power, right? Part of the problem we face today is that platforms are centralized locations of all the code and thus all the political power, right? So blockchain has the potential to flip this on its head by creating decentralization system of trust, such that content distribution and payments can happen without a platform sitting at the center of it. But again, very early days. Not trying to say like, oh, we'll just do this and be, and everything will be good. They have a lot of problems. This could be a whole talk in itself, right? The last one, that should have been moving the whole time. I apologize. It's funny. All right. The last one, and I'm not a particular fan of this idea, but I'd be remiss not to point out that regulating Facebook, Google, Apple, or Amazon, at the end it says regulated, regulated, regulated. I know it's hard to read with the cat. It's very excited. So we might want to regulate these companies that are incredibly powerful, that could create an environment where their grip in the greater online culture is kind of managed. And we can imagine a world where they're broken up, right? Again, I'll remind you of the one with the guy cutting down the tree, right? There could be debris from that. It could actually get really messy. There is the devil you don't know problem here. But overall, when I look at the Cambridge Analytica ruckus, to me the takeaway is that there's political pressure being put on Facebook, right? But at the same time, it doesn't really change the media's relationship to Facebook, except that this is a juicy story that we're beating them with. In truth, media entities have tried to do the same thing with Facebook data that Cambridge Analytica did to a lesser extent, right? Only a few years ago, BuzzFeed was beating its chest about how its edge over other media companies was its ability to understand data from social distribution, and they can use that better than anybody else, right? And the rest of the industry didn't call them out on this. They drooled, right? So that's just something to think about. These are the last two slides, I promise, and then I really want to get to questions. 20 minutes, that's good. The final thoughts that I sort of have is, one is, a central thesis of mine has always been that technology companies are media companies, and they know it, and they act like it, and they behave like it. Conversely, media companies will become technology companies, but we have not been preparing for this, right? There's a future where technology companies and media companies are somewhat indistinguishable from each other, right? We might not recognize that space any more than the owner of the first car would recognize a freeway today, right? But either way, we end up in that space, and the question is who defines the platforms that get us there, because creating platforms isn't benign, right? It defines the type of media produced. Again, that's kind of where we started. The last thing I'll mention is just a quick parting thought. It's a little bit of like a parable. It's actually from the Bible, but it's not meant to be religious. I'm going to give a humanistic interpretation of this, right? It's the story of Moses. Everybody kind of knows the story of Moses, right? He comes in, there's a bunch of plagues, right? Locusts and, I don't know, blood and wasps and all this bad stuff happens. And then the Pharaoh says, okay, get out of here. And he takes people, and God then parts the Red Seas. They go through the Red Seas, and then God closes it, right? And then who knows what happens in the story after that? That's right, right? This God character who did all these miracles could do anything. Does he whisk them away to the promised land or even a place with air conditioning? No, they wander in the desert for 40 years. And I think journalists, we are a little bit of a diaspora right now, right? We have been sort of kicked out of a place that we knew very well. And before we can get to a new place, we have to have generations that kind of live and die in the desert. And that sounds kind of sad, but I actually think there's a positive spin to it, which is this. The generations that were born or lived and died in the desert had a very important task, which is they had to decide what was worth strapping on their back for the next 40 years to take forward and what was worth ditching, right, leaving behind. The perfect example of this, again, I'm trying to give a humanistic interpretation of this, is, do we have time for the bread to rise? No. Fuck it. We'll take flatbread, crackers, let's go, right? Not important. But I'm sure there were other things like, oh, the Bible, the Torah, should we take that? Yes, right, let's take that. And different things were created while in the desert to accommodate their situation. So I actually think that there's a really grave responsibility that we all have during this time where we are kind of in the desert and we don't really feel like we have a home, which is we're the ones that will decide what are the moral values. I think those are the most important things that we want to strap on our backs and take forward, and what we're willing to ditch. And that's where, again, I think experimentation can happen. I'm not against that. But let me pause right there. And thank you. And I hope that we can get into it.
Thank you, David. Start thinking of questions, but I have one first. So you said we are a bit lost. Media companies are a bit lost. Are we lost because are we not being able to use technology to the ability that platform have? Are platform just smarter than us? Have they found a way to engage, to bring the audience with them on the platform and the media hasn't? Is it about identity, or is it about not having been able to find the right way, the right technology means, and not be prepared for it?
Sure. I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. I do think now we are, to use a phrase, outgunned, right? Like, I don't think that they are smarter than us. I do think that they are able to attract more talent than us right now. I'm sure we would love to attract the same talent. We just don't have the resources. So right now we're just like, we're going to a gunfight with a knife. Sorry to use all these like American gun analogies, but they make the point, right? I do think initially there was a mistake but that mistake is dated and it's not worth sort of going over. I don't think that holds us back. And again, I actually think the end game here is that technology companies and media companies become indistinguishable, right? There is a future where we don't refer to them as tech companies or media companies. They just are this kind of company. And again, it's not to say that they're all doing journalism, right? I mean, Apple, I would say, does media, right? Apple, which started off making hardware, sells books, sells movies, sells music. They sell media, not journalism necessarily, although they're creeping into it slowly, but media. So I don't want to conflate media and journalism necessarily, but I do want to conflate media and technology, if that makes sense.
Questions? Do we have a mic?
I sort of have two comments. Like, the first thing that you talked about was, sort of separating social from news, like your identity from necessarily news. But like, you know, when friends share their news, like they're essentially not sharing news, they're sharing what they think about it. But in this sense, I can sort of think of a scenario where, I mean, I know of people who only read news because their friends share it. So are you worried about a situation like that where like, you know, people just like are less interested in news because they're no longer getting it from like their community, from people they know? I know that this creates like an echo chamber sort of a problem, but at the same time, yeah. And my second was related to your the example of meme media. That's very interesting because right now we have this like big case happening in my country where the way that the media companies have made the most important point, which is the fact that our prime minister hasn't responded to anything, is by using that meme media. So are you saying that, I wanted to know your thoughts about the use of, you know, popular culture or media to like get across a point that journalists should be making? Yeah.
Sure, and I'll hopefully won't forget the second question while going back to the first one. And actually, quickly restate the first one. It was about how people get their content, right? And the one of the most important sort of lines that came out of, again, the sort of years leading up to this was, if the news is important, it will come to me, right? I forget, it was like a young kid who said that on stage. When he was being interviewed about his news habits, and he said, "Look, if the news is important, it will come to me." And to a certain extent, I don't disagree with that. And you know, I want to point out, I've been sort of railing a lot on the tech platforms and how media companies have screwed the pooch on this. But I also hinted a little bit, especially with that one with the axe and the things falling. It's like we're in an intractable position. We do rely on them for distribution, right? And the media industry goes through the kind of pendulum shift, is the way I'll describe it. Right? And we're actually on our way back to a place that we've already been. So like from 2008 to 2010, I might be getting the dates wrong a little bit, right? We were sort of in this like rush of excitement of entrepreneurialism and like brave new world kind of space, and Huffington Post kind of led the way. And SEO was all the rage, search engine optimization. Write your headline for Google. Google was the dominant platform, right? Eventually that kind of swung back, and like there was this fear of like, oh, we've given up too much control, Google is the enemy, right, sort of. And I think we actually overcorrected a little bit, and then we swung back on social really hard and fast from maybe 2014 to 2016, right, maybe even 17, you might say. And BuzzFeed led the way, right, and Huffington Post at that point it's almost legacy, right, and they were following BuzzFeed's kind of, you know, and now I think we are saying, oh, we went too far on social distribution. We need to come back to things like membership, subscribers, hold personal events, do local, right? And again, there's the real fear that we will overcompensate, which I think is what you're describing, right? Like this fear of like, well, we'll just be closed off, right? News shouldn't be just for the elite people who care, right? How do you make it relevant? And in that pendulum swing back and forth, in fact, maybe I'll even find it. I often give a talk where I use a pendulum swinging little thing here, right? Like, you know, there's a center that is kind of where we should be. Like there's an equilibrium there that we need to find, and that's really difficult to find. And I think that kind of answers your other question as well, which is to say, I don't think that news should be voice from nowhere. I actually do think it needs to be engaging and funny. I just think I question often the motivation, right? Because once you get into a place where you have a really clear sense of demographics, right? And you're like, oh, this is our demographic, we're just gonna do things for them. It changes the way you approach all things, right? As opposed to like, there's actually a point we need to make here. Something happened in the world and we need to make this point for all people, right? That's a subtle shift. And it's difficult. Again, these are not easy things to suss out.
The second question was about political meme.
Oh, that was actually what I was just sort of talking about. Did it make sense? Yeah, okay.
More questions?
Hi. I wanted to know if you, yes. I wanted to know if you think that the publishing or the news industry can learn anything from the music industry. Because there was a moment when they were very powerful because they controlled both the content and the distribution of that content. And when you gave the example of Apple becoming a media company because they started selling songs, not albums, songs, they essentially debundled a good part of the business model of most record companies, which are now trying to reinvent themselves. Do you think there's a lesson there for the news industry?
Yeah, I mean, the first gut thought is the debundling has already happened. So, but I do think it's interesting that you have a player like Spotify that had to come in as a third party to really succeed in the streaming of music, because the album companies couldn't have done it with each other. They needed a independent kind of actor to come in and do it for them, which is interesting because, again, that's sort of this acknowledgement that you needed a tech company, a tech platform to solve a problem that the industry had, to create a regular demand for music. I actually think that there's a lot of industries that we could look at and learn from. You know, and actually, I think a lot of industries will learn from us, right? If you take a 10,000 year kind of look at what we're doing, or 5,000 year, you know, we are moving from the industrial era to the information era. And if you think about newspapers, that's a very industrial product, right? It's like printed on paper, you put it on trucks, it goes, right? So any industry that deals with the flow of information are going to be the canaries in the coal mine, right? Of what are the shifts when you go from the industrial era to the information era. And that takes a long time to play out. Again, 40 years, probably more. And I think industries like news, universities, libraries, and music, to the extent that music is information, anything that deals with the flow of information are going to be the ones that others will learn from.
More questions? I have another one then.
Okay.
So, you know, we talked for so long about the fact that we, as publisher, needed to be where the audience was and engage the audience in the platform and in the space that was more natural to the audience. And you talked before about finding the more environmentally friendly equivalent of some platform.
Sure.
And so, sure, there are a lot of other platforms we could look at. But what if our audience is not on that platform? How do you decide where to engage your audience? And what if that platform at some point turns into Facebook?
Sure. And it's funny, too, because like I've actually specifically not talked about business in all of this, right? Or, I mean, I've made hints to it, right? Because, again, in that pendulum shift, right, I'll contrast BuzzFeed on one side, which is all about social distribution, and The Information on the other. There's an organization in San Francisco called The Information. Have any of you guys heard of it? One. And that's totally fine with them, because it costs $400 a year to subscribe, right? So, you know, they don't care about social distribution. They cover the technology industry, right? So it's for people in technology. That's why it's so expensive, right? But they don't need millions and millions and millions of views on Facebook. They need, I'm bad at math here, but if they got, you know, 10,000 subscribers or 5,000, that's millions of dollars, right? That's plenty, right? 10,000 people, right? So part of it is the value of the user that you acquire, to use a language, right? If you can acquire 1,000 users, right, on something like Patreon, right, which again is on the opposite side. If you're a Patreon journalist and you have 1,000 people giving you $100, you know, a month, that's, you know, probably extreme, but, you know, you're making a good living, right? You don't care, right? You care about, you know, top of the funnel and like going on Facebook to try and acquire new users, but it's a much different game than if you're making money purely off that. So part of it is like, what are you covering? What is the value of the user over a lifetime? How much does it cost to acquire them? There's a lot of business that goes on to some of these questions, which is just to say that it's not impossible, right? Difficult, especially because, like I said, Facebook represents the largest audience in the history of humanity. But I often talk about Facebook as like top of the funnel. They're the top of the funnel. But you have to get people down to the bottom of the funnel. This is like a business kind of term of like, top of the funnel is basically marketing, right? A billboard, thousands of people will see it, but like of the thousands of people that see a billboard, one might make a purchase, right? Or whatever percentage. And at a certain point, the business will say that billboard was worth it, right? So Facebook is our billboard. But really what we need to do is figure out what is the bottom, right? This is where you do get into things like what Jay Rosen talks about with, you know, optimizing for trust, right? Creating that new relationship, right? And again, I actually don't think that if you are just playing in that top of the funnel, just in Facebook, I think it's really hard to build that kind of trust over time. But you know, and I could be wrong, right? Again, if there are questions, I don't know if we have time, but I actually love to get challenged on these things, so please don't hesitate.
Anyone to challenge?
Somebody must think that I'm full of bullshit. Come on. Do you think I'm full of bullshit?
No, but I have one last question then.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned the information of the big player. Is anyone who's doing it right? And if you don't want to name a company over another, is there anyone who's doing something right in getting ahead of this problem?
That was a big sigh. I think there are lots of people doing it right in lots of different ways, right? Like I mentioned the Washington Post, not only with their team on Reddit, but they also are creating their own CMS and now licensing that CMS out. I think that's really important. Here's a media company that sees itself as a media company making a platform, a CMS, right? So they're going to instill certain values in it from a sort of journalistic point of view that maybe Facebook in its open CMS wouldn't. So that's, I think, an example from a big player of something that I think is positive. That's not to say, you know, Washington Post amazing, New York Times crap. The New York Times is doing lots of interesting things as well. I think there's a lot of different, you know, things that we can try. And this is where, again, I don't want to come off as a curmudgeon of saying like, oh, we shouldn't be trying anything else. We should just go back to newspapers and, you know, grumble a lot. That is not at all what I'm suggesting. In fact, the opposite, right? That we actually do need to invest more in this, because when we invest in it, especially from a platform or a technological perspective, we will imbue values into it. And so we either create those platforms ourselves or hope that somebody else will create those platforms like a Spotify and they'll get our values right. But I think hope is a really shitty strategy.
On this note of optimism, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And again, not hard to find, so happy to talk more.